Good evening to you and good evening everybody at home. We have a lot to get to tonight. President Trump will soon land in Buenos Aires, where he will tango, so to speak, with world leaders. But it is dinner on Saturday with the president of China that will be the main course. It is not getting that much coverage today, but there is intense focus everywhere on this man.
Now Michael Cohen could be the most dangerous witness to the president and his presidency in this Russia probe.
Michael Cohen could be the single most terrifying person for Donald Trump, the single most destructive person for Donald Trump.
So we will get to that story in a moment with Michael Caputo and with Jonathan Turley coming up. That story putting Vladimir Putin back in the spotlight today as well. The president dusted the Russian leader, will now not meet with him at the G20. Tweeting this: based on the fact that the ships and sailors have not been returned to Ukraine from Russia, I've decided it would be best for all parties concerned to cancel my previously scheduled meeting. Critics were quick to draw lines between that announcement and the news about Michael Cohen, but history may be more telling on this. Look no further than the G7 and NATO summits, where the president's approach to diplomacy was often characterized as a bull in a china shop. Only this time, it will not be President Putin's china shop that everyone has their eyes on. Rather, President Xi of China and the ongoing battle between our two countries for global military and economic supremacy. What happens between these two men may be the real defining story of the Trump presidency and foreign policy. This is likely the superpower showdown, ultimately, of our time. Chief White House correspondent John Roberts live in Buenos Aires tonight, where all of this is going down. Good evening, John.
Good evening to you, Martha, and you're absolutely correct. The meeting with President Xi on Saturday night was always the most important meeting. The fact that the president was going to meet with Vladimir Putin was also seen as a seminal moment for this upcoming G20. But really, the meeting, which will be at dinner on Saturday night between President Trump and President Xi, could well set the course for what the future relationship is, particularly trade between the United States and China. Larry Kudlow, who is the president's chief economic advisor, briefed us a couple of times earlier this week. He said the president has recently reopened dialogue with President Xi and that President Trump is optimistic that Saturday's meeting could lead to some sort of breakthrough. Not going to fix everything. This could be baby steps towards some sort of different trade relationship. But they are hopeful that something may begin to break loose on Saturday night. The president, though, playing a little hardball as he was leaving the White House this morning, saying if Xi does not want to forge a new trade agreement, well, he's fine with that. Listen here.
I think we're very close to doing something with China, but I don't know that I want to do it, because what we have right now is billions and billions of dollars coming into the United States in the form of tariffs or taxes. So I really don't know, but I will tell you that I think China wants to make a deal. I'm open to making a deal, but frankly, I like the deal we have right now.
Don't forget the tariffs on Chinese goods right now, and there's some $250 billion worth of Chinese goods that are subject to tariffs is 10%. That is scheduled to rise to 25% on the 1st of January, and the president has another tranche of $257 billion in Chinese goods that he is targeting for tariffs. U.S. officials say that they have been disappointed, that's the word they used, disappointed in how trade talks between China and the United States have been going. They say one of the big problems is China still claims to be a third world country, and because of that, they still need all the breaks that are afforded them under the World Trade Organization agreement. But consider this. China has an economy of $12 trillion a year. The United States, $19 trillion. China just $7 trillion behind. So the United States, the White House, doesn't see the need for all these WTO protections. Reforming the WTO rules has been a big topic at the ministerial meetings in Mar del Plata here in Argentina, leading up to this weekend's G20 Leaders Summit. And the United States is getting a lot of support that China is trying to have it 9 ways to Sunday here to take advantage of every trade opportunity that they possibly can. And in doing so, really scoop up a lot of intellectual property, ownership in a lot of businesses, and technology transfer that the president really wants to stop. Martha?
John Roberts, thank you very much. In Buenos Aires tonight, here now, Tom Rogan, Washington Examiner commentary writer, and Mark Thiessen, American Enterprise Institute scholar and Fox News contributor. So, Tom, let me start with sort of the big opening question here tonight. There's obviously a lot of focus on what's going on with the Russia investigation and the president's decision not to sit down with Vladimir Putin here. But when you look ultimately at the military expansionism of China and the way that they are trying to basically, clean our clock in every possible category in the coming decades, this is really so central, I think, to what the president's legacy will really ultimately be about.
I think it absolutely will. I mean, the challenge from Russia is a Russia that is in decline, but a Russia that is capable in terms of various spheres. But I also think that when you look at China in terms of the global economic order that it wants to establish, and I think that's important to note, displacing the American rules-based order and replacing it with one that is feudal mercantilism, with Beijing as the center, and then on the second step, the imperial strategy in the Asia-Pacific, the Indo-Pacific, to try and make all those other nations there have to salute essentially Beijing. That showdown is critical, and President Trump, I think, gets very high grades so far in terms of challenging the Chinese in ways that I don't think they would have expected when he first entered office.
Mark, what do you expect this weekend from this meeting?
I expect that Donald Trump is exactly where he is, where he said coming out of the White House today, which is if he gets a deal, if the Chinese want a deal, that's great. If not, he's very happy where he is. I mean, I think Trump has all the leverage going into this meeting for two reasons. Number one, the U.S. economy is booming, whereas China's is stagnating. They've had the worst economic growth this year since 2009. And second of all, the Chinese took their shot at Donald Trump this year. If you recall, after he put his first sanctions down on China, they retaliated very smartly. What they did was they went after Trump voters. They targeted soybeans. 90% of they're the largest soybean importer of the United States, and 90% of the soybeans come from states that voted for Donald Trump. So they were targeting states like North Dakota and Indiana and Missouri, hoping to help Trump's opponents and then maybe have him lose the Senate over these tariffs. And what happened was the opposite. Claire McCaskill lost, Joe Donnelly lost, and Heitkamp lost in North Dakota, and so that play failed. Trump won all of the rural areas in the House. Where his losses were in the suburbs. So the Chinese took their kill shot to try and go after him, and it failed. So what that means is going in, Trump really doesn't mind the sanctions because the Trump voters in those rural states that were depending on China trade backed him in the last election and gave him a mandate to get tough with Beijing.
Yeah, I mean, what fascinates me is that we've been talking about this issue with China for decades. And in terms of having the fortitude to stand up to them, we really have never actually done it. There's an interesting conversation that was outlined in a very interesting Wall Street Journal piece today about the relationship and the back and forth on these deals, and Steve Mnuchin's efforts and Wilbur Ross's efforts to kind of create a negotiating platform that would work. And one of the Chinese advisors told a group of U.S. executives, "We understand the U.S. better than the other way around, and we are willing to endure far more pain without conceding." Tom, do you think that they may have met their match in President Trump or not?
Well, I think they have to a degree, but President Trump has to keep up with this. What the Chinese will do is try and offer some concessions and then break out of them over the following months and years. And so the key for the United States, I think that is absolutely right, that the Chinese play a very long game here. But the key for President Trump is to protect the keystone strengths of American power, which is the rule of law-based international order. Vietnam now loves the United States because the Chinese try and play them. Intellectual property, those high-tech companies that will create the jobs for the growing economy around the world. Protect that, and then in the ultimate long-term interest of the United States, to trust that China's economic model of authoritarianism, of very poor people in the rural areas, of a middle class that is denied freedom, of a Xi Jinping who likes to think he knows rather than the free market best about economic investment. Trust that America will win out, because that's ultimately what won the Cold War, and it will win this Cold War as well.
I mean, you look at the battle over GM. There's also a piece in this story that talks about how the Chinese leadership went around to all the American companies that have businesses there and said, you have to stay with us. You have to stay here in China. We're going to continue to give you advantages if you choose to do that, Mark. That's the on-the-ground battle with these companies. And GM basically made a pretty clear decision this week.
Yeah, they did. And look, Donald Trump has to be tough about that, because the reality is that, and they also do the same thing, quite frankly, with intellectual property, where if you want to do business in the Chinese market, they bring you in and then they make you hand over your intellectual property. I mean, the reality is that, look, the trade wars with the European Union and with Canada, those are wars of choice. Those are we can debate whether or not it's smart to impose sanctions and get into a trade battle with our allies. But China is an economic predator, and I think most people on the left, right, and center, whether they agree with or disagree with how Donald Trump is handling this, recognize that China is a predator country that is stealing our intellectual property, that is rigging the rules of the game, that is imposing massive non-tariff barriers on U.S. economic opportunity in the country, including massive subsidies from the People's Liberation Army and the government into all sorts of sectors where the U.S. can't compete. And so the only way that's not going to get settled through the WTO. And so Donald Trump is saying, I'm going to impose tariffs on you and make it hurt, and that's the only way that we're going to get through to China and make them change their ways.
Well, watching these two head-to-head is fascinating. We remember the Mar-a-Lago dinner, during which the president leaned over at one point and said, by the way, I just sent 50-something missiles into Syria, and here's your cake for dessert. So we'll see what happens in the Buenos Aires. Thank you very much, gentlemen. Great to see both of you tonight. So still ahead this evening, as promised, we will get into this story. Michael Cohen admits to lying about a business deal in Moscow. Was he ever a credible witness in this case to begin with? That's debatable, and we will discuss it on both sides. My next guests have some doubts and some input on this with their own experience, and they will explain what they think about it coming up next.
There's no doubt in my mind that he's just not credible. Before you finish with him, you're going to have such a string of lies, you just can't trust him. And you put him under this kind of pressure, and what's his history been? His history has been lying under pressure.
Insurance that won't replace the full value of your new car? You're better off throwing your money right into the harbor. Gonna regret that.
Day for the Mueller team. Only time really will tell about all of this, but the president's former attorney, Michael Cohen, a man who previously said that he would take a bullet for President Trump, has pleaded guilty to lying to Congress in the Russia probe, saying that he made false statements in 2017 about plans to build a Trump Tower in Moscow. Cohen claiming that he did it, quote, to be consistent with individual number one's political messaging and out of loyalty to individual one being President Trump. But Cohen, who looked very weary, to say the least, leaving court today, and understandably so, has been both the president's most fierce ally and now, of course, has turned against him in this case, putting, as he says, his family and his country first. The president sees something else at work here.
What he's trying to do is get a reduced sentence. So he's lying about a project that everybody knew about. I mean, we were very open with it.
Here now, Michael Caputo is former Trump 2016 campaign advisor. Michael, welcome back to the program tonight. Your reaction to this news today that Mr. Cohen has said that he lied to Congress about the dates during which he was pursuing a building project, I should say, in Moscow.
I don't think anybody's surprised, really. I mean, even the guy on the other side of the transaction, Felix Sater, was contradicting him all the way in the run-up to this. And those of us who know Michael Cohen, who were around before the campaign, it's not surprising that the one who would never take a bullet for Donald Trump is Michael Cohen. It's a shame, but I got to believe that he's trying to save his skin. That's what the special counsel does. They terrorize people like Michael Cohen, Paul Manafort, Jerry Corsi, trying to make you fold, trying to bankrupt you, so that you'll tell the public the narrative that the special counsel wants to put out there. Paul Manafort, Jerry Corsi aren't willing to do that. Well, Michael Cohen is perfectly willing to do so.
All right. Michael, when you look at where this stands right now and you think back to your days involved with the campaign, did you ever hear any discussion? I mean, really, you have to get down to the core of this. And the question is whether or not there was any sort of trade-off. Was it, we're going to do this big project in Moscow, and if we lose the election, then at least we'll have this project going on, and we will have made these introductories and the ability to do business there. Or was it, if Russia leaks, these emails or finds a way to hack into them, then we'll reward you with that. I mean, that's what it comes down to. Is there a quid pro quo, an arrangement, a relationship to help in the election or not?
Well, I was in Trump Tower for a lot of the campaign. I started with the campaign in November of 15, and I was around for a lot of time before that. You know, I probably had more contacts with Russia because I lived there for 7 years than anyone else in Trump Tower. I never heard word one about this magical project in Moscow. You know, Michael Cohen had this portfolio where he was out looking for big deals so he could get the big commissions off of it. And, you know, it looks like another one of those projects that Michael Cohen had, he was kind of famous for, where, you know, the unicorn turned into just another horse here. And he ends up, you know, just getting small cuts on apartments that he sold. This is, you know, par for the course, I think, with Michael Cohen. And unfortunately, he's out there just trying to save his skin. And we don't see any proof of any collusion with Russia at any angle on this whole entire investigation. And today's guilty plea from Michael Cohen doesn't get us any closer to it.
Michael Caputo, thank you very much. Good to have you here tonight. So here now with more on the legal side of this. Thank you. Jonathan Turley joins me now, constitutional law professor at George Washington University. Jonathan, good to have you with us tonight. You know, when you look at what happened today, it's interesting because Robert Mueller turned over the early part of the Michael Cohen investigation to New York, and that had to do with tax issues and financial improprieties. Now, this part is the first time that he sort of has his hands on this chapter in this story with regard to Michael Cohen, and now he comes forward for the second time in all of this and says, I did this because of the campaign, or I did this because I was covering for President Trump. How much did Mueller get from Michael Cohen, do you think, today?
Well, the problem is not what he got, but who he got it from. You know, Michael Cohen has achieved a curious form of perfection. He sometimes seems to have lied every time to everyone about everything. And that makes him what the law sometimes calls a libel-proof individual, someone who has no reputation to lose. And that's not exactly a very credible witness. Now, can a witness like that hurt you? Well, sure. I mean, if he has emails and other things to support him, Mueller is saying that he apparently believes this latest account. But when you boil this down, the risk to the president is hard to discern on the issue of the Trump Tower. There's nothing criminal there. The greatest threat would be if Cohen goes further and says that he not only lied to Congress, but he did so with the knowledge or encouragement of the president. That could be suborning perjury as an allegation, which is a federal crime if you encourage someone to lie. But he hasn't done that yet. So we're not too sure how Mueller is going to use him. Yeah. But what is clear, as you've noted, you know, when they transferred this case to New York, I said at the time that I thought this was a clever tactical move by not just Mueller, but Rosenstein, to guarantee that they couldn't shut down the investigation by shifting this over to New York. It was clear all along that he was being really developed for the special counsel.
So, you know, in terms of, you mentioned the project, and that in and of itself is not illegal. He was a real estate developer. He was building things all around the world, and, you know, had looked into this project clearly, which he talked about himself at the time. And so the timeline, whether or not that ended in January or that ended in June, beside the fact that he didn't tell the truth about that date, is that date material?
Well, the greatest use of that is not that it's a crime clearly defined in the criminal code, but that they will use it as part of a narrative that this was the reason why Trump seemed so favorably inclined towards Russia, and there might have been this quid pro quo. But that's a very loose narrative. You need a lot more than someone like Michael Cohen or these dates to make out that type of allegation. I mean, the problem is the president has denied that he had knowledge about the WikiLeaks issue from Stone, that he had knowledge of the Trump Tower meeting. If Mueller doesn't knock those statements down, and if he does, then we have serious crimes in terms of false statements. But if he doesn't knock those down, it's hard for him to keep this narrative going. You know, it's like not having the corpus delicti. He needs to start with something that is the reason for all of this obstruction and all these other alleged crimes.
Jonathan Turley, always great to talk to you. Thank you very much for being here tonight.
Thanks, Martha.
So whatever happened to that congressional hush fund? Do you remember this story? It was used by members of Congress to settle cases of sexual misconduct. Of course, they only have your tax dollars to spend money on, so that's how they did it. So why this is about to become a big issue for Nancy Pelosi. So tonight, the head of California's Democratic Party, Eric Bauman, pictured here, announcing publicly that he will resign amid allegations of sexual misconduct. He was accused by 10 political activists and staff members of engaging in unwanted touching, making crude sexual comments, other lewd acts. So it raises the question, whatever happened to the Congressional Hush Fund that paid to settle allegations of sexual abuse by members of Congress and used your taxpayer money to do it? A new bill is underway that would lift that veil of secrecy, and it could be one of Nancy Pelosi's first tests if she wins her speaker battle. Here she is earlier this year on this.
I think that the elected officials, the members of Congress, should be held accountable. I think there's possibly legislation that says that anybody who has done this or does it in the future, this will be made known to the public, as long as the victim agrees to that.
And you would support that?
Yeah, for sure.
For sure, she said. Joining me now, Penny Nance, Concerned Women for America CEO and president, who has written an editorial that is about to be published about this. Penny, welcome. Good to have you with us this evening. Now, this is something that Congressman Ron DeSantis supported a lot. There was a lot of lip service given to making this public information, this hush fund with taxpayer money. Where do we stand on that?
Nowhere. Nothing happened. We're 1 year later, Martha, and we still do not know which members used approximately $17 million of the taxpayer funds. There's 264 cases, and we don't know who they were. And we believe at Concerned Women for America that the taxpayer has a right to know. We want to know who we covered up for, and there needs to be restitution. And so you mentioned a legislation earlier. Ron DeSantis, who has now been elected as governor of Florida, will be leaving. We'd love for Congress to clear this up in this last few minutes, but, you know, we don't think that'll happen. But this then falls on the plate of Nancy Pelosi. And let's see if she's serious. We don't just want to know the names of the members of Congress. We want restitution, whether this is coming from their paychecks now or even people that have retired. It's coming through their congressional pension.
Yeah, I mean,
think
it's a
the
great
taxpayers
question.
have a right to know.
You know, and as you point out, there's, you know, this whole new freshman class that has a lot of women in it, and we would expect that they will be leading the charge on this, and we're going to be watching, as I know you will as well. Let's put up some of the people that we do know the names of who were accused and left their positions on Capitol Hill. They were accused and left, all except for Bobby Scott, who was just reelected. He was accused, and we should point out that accused and convicted are two different things, but the others left under those circumstances. You know, so with regard to who pays for this, you know, is there discussion that perhaps this should come out of personal pockets? You know, and that the American people, this really isn't their problem, isn't our problem to pay for these issues?
It isn't our problem. You're right about that, and we are strongly advocating that point, that if a member of Congress acts badly, and mostly this is what we know about, and we don't know very much, but what we know about, we have issues like John Conyers, who was trying to host meetings in his underwear with his staff. We have Blake Farenthold, who was sharing, and for $84,000, by the way, from Blake Farenthold, was sharing his sexual fantasies about his comms director. And when she had the audacity to complain, they fired her. And then you have other people like Eric Massa from New York, who was sexually harassing young men in his office and called it a tickle fight. I mean, this isn't just a offhanded comment. These are very serious allegations and misdeeds by the powerful against the weak. As a former staffer on Capitol Hill, as the mother of a daughter in her 20s, this will never change until we hold people accountable, until these allegations see the light of day, and the voter can decide and really make a change.
I mean, we're going to watch. We'll see what Nancy Pelosi does. We'll see what all of these freshman women who have come in, whether or not they will take up this charge. And as you said, you know, all of these people raise money to run for office. So perhaps some of those donors would like to cover these costs, because I don't think you or I or anybody else in this country feels like it's right for this to come out of our pocket. Penny, thank you very much. Great to see you tonight.
Thank you. You too. God bless.
So still ahead this evening, a one-time billionaire bigwig with a horrific record of alleged sex crimes, speaking of that, used his connections to the rich and powerful to dodge the most severe punishment that he faced. But today we found out that this story is not ending there. Investigative reporters at the Miami Herald have dug into a long dormant story, and what they found about Jeffrey Epstein, the one-time billionaire hedge fund manager turned sex offender, could blow the whole sordid tale wide open once again. You may remember this story. Epstein, who served only 13 months in prison, is still involved in 2 pending civil suits. In one set that is set to go to trial next week, the young women, who are now grown women, say that they were assaulted by him and that they are now speaking out, and they want to be heard to tell all that they know about what went on behind these gates in his home in Palm Beach, Florida. Trace Gallagher, live now from our West Coast newsroom with the full report tonight. Trace, good evening.
Good evening, Martha. These civil cases are significant because back in 2008, Jeffrey Epstein's alleged victims were shut out of the legal process altogether. They were not allowed to testify or even give character witness statements. Stunning, considering the litany of horrifying allegations laid out by the Miami Herald, including the paper identifying some 80 women who say that from 2001 to 2006, they were molested or sexually abused by Jeffrey Epstein. And FBI and court records show that Epstein put together a network of underage girls and forced them to perform sex acts at his Palm Beach mansion. He was also suspected of trafficking minors from overseas to sex parties at his various homes around the world. Prosecutors identified 36 underage victims. So how does a man facing a 53-page indictment and life in a maximum security federal prison end up serving 13 months in a private wing of the Palm Beach County Jail, being allowed to leave his cell 6 days a week to go to work? Well, the answer, according to the Herald, is current Labor Secretary and potential Attorney General nominee Alexandra Acosta, who in 2007 was Miami's top prosecutor and accepted a deal called a non-prosecution agreement, where Epstein pleaded guilty to prostitution charges in state court and in turn got immunity from federal charges. The deal also protected Epstein's accomplices from prosecution, meaning if other well-known influential people were having sex with minors, they would not be identified or prosecuted. And again, the alleged victims had no recourse. A lawyer representing victims said, quote, "The damage that happened in this case is unconscionable. How in the world do you, the U.S. attorney, engage in a negotiation with a criminal defendant, basically allowing that criminal defendant to write up the agreement?" The answer might be a quid pro quo. Remember, this happened back in 2008 at the height of the global financial crisis, and Epstein gave unknown information to investigators regarding 2 executives with Bear Stearns, which failed in 2008. Alexander Acosta would later say he felt pressured by Epstein's powerful legal team, including Alan Dershowitz and Ken Starr, though the Herald believes Acosta had a good working relationship with Epstein's legal team, including private email communications and negotiations to lessen jail time. But 10 years later, Epstein may yet find himself back in a federal courtroom. Martha.
Thank you very much, Trace Gallagher in Los Angeles. Here now, Charles Hurd, opinion editor at the Washington Times and a Fox News contributor, and Juan Williams, co-host of The Five and Fox News political analyst. Gentlemen, welcome to both of you. You know, I mean, we all remember this story, and the details of it were just incredible. I mean, you know, he had all these places all around the world and these underage girls that were brought in, and his friends, you know, high-powered, big names, many of them. And, you know, it was just, when you heard that he got 13 months, it was a little hard to imagine that all of those charges could boil down to that. And now you read this piece, very good reporting by the Miami Herald, Juan, and you look at this and you look at the Me Too moment that has followed, really wasn't underway in full swing, I guess you could say, at that point. What do you make of this story?
Well, the politics of it just stand out, because this is not really about, you know, what we would normally think of as a plea deal. This is really about the politics and the power, the connection. You know, I'm reminded of, you know, O.J. Simpson or Harvey Weinstein, Martha. I don't think that there's equal justice when you have the kind of power, money, and connections that these people have. And that's what you see with Jeffrey Epstein. So recently, Dianne Feinstein, when Alex Acosta was nominated to be Labor Secretary, did not vote for him based on this. But she didn't have all the information. It's in the Miami Herald story that we're now learning. And it is incredible to me the number of people, the number of young women who were abused. They were often poor young women, lured to his house with offers of money, then a pyramid scheme in which they were paid additional funds to bring in other unsuspecting young women. And the bottom line here is that Epstein basically got away with it because the young women were not told about the plea deal. They couldn't go into court and challenge the idea that this man, who was facing potentially a life sentence, was only getting 13 months and, as you just heard from Trace, able to leave 6 days a week.
Yeah, which is unbelievable. I mean, basically wasn't in prison at all. I mean, he was allowed to leave and go to work 6 days a week. You know, Charlie, this was done at a breakfast arrangement between Mr. Acosta and the attorneys. And, you know, Acosta at that hearing said in response to what Juan just brought up, you know, we wanted to make sure he did time. And that's why this settlement was made. We wanted to make sure that he did time. Part of this arrangement, and then I want to get your response, Charlie, of course, but is that these girls, 14-year-old girls, were determined to be prostitutes. You know, I don't know how you can have that label at the age of 14.
No, you can't. No. There's there's no there's no definition in federal law that allows for that either, and it shouldn't have been allowed in this case. It really is, you know, and we don't know what sort of everything that went on behind the scenes, but this right here is exactly why people despise politics. It's why so many Americans have an eroded faith in the federal government, is because of things like this. And as I think Juan very ably pointed out, you know, if there's a dual system of justice in this country, and the idea that this guy has so much money and he has so many political connections that he can get away with something that should have put him in jail absolutely for the rest of his life, and he should have lost every penny that he's ever made in his life. It's absolutely despicable. And I think, and by the way, you know, it's politics. It's on both sides. There's, or I should say, all around. And the idea that, and I do think that Alex Acosta and everybody inside the DOJ who had any fingerprints whatsoever on this should be forced to step forward and explain what happened. And if indeed there were problems with the prosecution that made it difficult to envision getting a conviction where he would see a long prison sentence, well, my goodness, go ahead and push the case and reveal all of what those problems are. But to just short circuit it and not allow these young women, these girls, to stand in front of who willingly wanted to stand in front of the monster who allegedly did these things to them, and to confront him is such a miscarriage of justice.
They may get their opportunity, and the Me Too movement,
I hope they do,
has perhaps opened a door with these 2 new charges that may allow them to get their moment. You know, some of them are moms now; they're a lot older. They've gone on with their lives, but they would like to see justice done in this case, and we will be watching it. Gentlemen, thank you. Great to see both of you tonight. So coming up next, the first federal prosecutor to take on child predators inside the Catholic Church. Detailed the devastating report out of Pennsylvania on priest abuse, and with states across the country now taking on similar investigations, this story is far from over. But long before the report was made public, my next guest knew there was a serious problem that was going on. Former U.S. Attorney David Hickton is a Catholic who attended a Catholic school where some of the accused predator priests were assigned. Decades later, he would become the very first federal prosecutor to go after the Catholic Church and help successfully put away 2 priests. Tonight, he is looking forward at what must happen now to protect children and to fix the church that he loves. David Hickton served as U.S. Attorney for the Western District of Pennsylvania from 2010 to 2016 and is the founding director of the University of Pittsburgh Institute for Cyber Law, Policy, and Security. David, thank you very much. Good to have you with us tonight. This is personal for you. When you were in grammar school, some of your friends on the basketball team, little boys, after practice would tremble at the end of practice. Why would they do that?
Well, I described that story because we had a predator coach who was engaged in behavior that we now see is all too often discovered in many schools. So I don't think my experience is that much different than many people who went to Catholic school. We're just all finding out about it. I knew about it then. It came and went, and it was always in my mind as something that was very disturbing. I was not personally a victim, but certainly we were all a part of the same team, and I carried it with me for a long time.
You did not give up your faith. Some people who have experienced this or know people who have do. You say that you sometimes get sideways glances at church. Why?
Well, I think when I went after some of the priests, we had a conviction here in Pittsburgh and one in Johnstown, and then I very publicly announced that I was going to impose a RICO investigation on the church. I think some people were so imbued with the church cover-up for so many years that they saw what I was doing was an attack on the church. And whenever that happened, I would quickly tell people that what I was doing was the right thing to do. It was the correct thing to do. It was legally, ethically the right thing to do. But the problem was not created by me. It was created by the church. And I think that reaction from some Catholics is one of the reasons we're still talking about this problem, which is 5 decades old.
Yeah. There's a nun that you say is the reason that you maintained your faith all throughout, and we have a picture of her. Why was she so important in your life?
Well, Sister Marlene Luffy was a huge figure in my life. She taught me in 1st grade, 2nd grade, 5th grade, 8th grade. She was my French teacher, and she was the principal, and she remains a close friend today. In fact, when I was sworn in as U.S. Attorney, she spoke and said the prayers at the investiture ceremony. But, you know, the Catholic Church is just a vehicle for the expression of your faith. It does not represent your faith. And it's, like many institutions, composed of good and bad, good people and bad people, and the Catholic Church does a lot of good. Sister Marlene represents the high watermark of the good of the Catholic Church, at least in my experience, and she has been a huge positive impact on me, a great developer of whatever foundation exists that has allowed me to live a successful and happy life.
A lot of people have similar stories about special nuns and priests in their lives. Before I let you go, what's the one thing that you would tell the Vatican or the hierarchy in this country they need to do now?
They need to admit that these were crimes against children. There were crimes in the cover-up. I think we need to get a clean slate and move forward. I'd be an advocate for giving women a greater role in the leadership in the church and perhaps making women as priests. I think that would go a long way.
David Hickton, I hope you'll join us again, sir. Thank you very much. Good to have you with us tonight. So coming up next, an incredible show of patriotism from thousands of total strangers who all gathered to honor one of our nation's veterans who had no family. Thousands of strangers showed up to pay tribute to an American hero. That was the story in Omaha, Nebraska on Tuesday, after an obituary for Vietnam veteran Stanley Stoltz read that he had no known family. Word quickly spread around town, leading to an outpouring of support from a patriotic community with as many as 2,000 people showing up to honor this veteran for his service to our nation. Here now is one of those supporters, Mary Rosenthal, Vice President of First Responders Foundation. Mary, thank you very much for being here this evening. It's good to have you. We should mention that we now understand that there was a brother who did arrive at this gathering, but the larger point is just the need to make sure that in this moment, our veterans are shown the kind of support and love that our nation has for them, right?
Right. Omaha is such a strong, compassionate, thankful, patriotic community because we have Offutt Air Force Base, which is right outside Omaha. It's home of the U.S. Strategic Command, and the citizens of Omaha have just completely supported the military, both past, present, and then the people who will serve in the future as well.
And I know that the person who was overseeing this ceremony said, you know, occasionally we'll get 15, 20 people who will come whenever they hear that a veteran is being buried. Why 2,000? How did this happen?
You know, I think with social media, you know, people will put out things on Twitter and Facebook. I put things out, and I was surprised that I had people from West Virginia and all over the country that were retweeting it as well. With the social media, it's easier to reach people. And like I said, once you put this out in front of the citizens of Omaha, they're going to be there. They're going to be there to support this veteran.
What would you tell people who watch this and they say, I would like to do that in my community. I would like to be present for someone who may not have anybody there for them?
Well, the first thing is to find out when there's a veteran in the situation. I mean, we were lucky that somebody posted the obituary on social media, and it just kind of went viral from there. But as soon as people can find out about it and they can spread the word, I don't think there's any community in the United States that wouldn't come out in droves to support something like this.
Yeah, we just put on the screen the notification that said that Private Stoltz had no known family. And it's just moving to read those words and to see the flag next to it, and it was put out by the funeral home. You know, what's your message to people across this country when they look at that and they read his name and they think about so many others out there who have given their lives or given their service to our country?
Right. I think for most people, they have a deep appreciation for the military, for what they do, for the ones that didn't come home. And so when you have somebody that doesn't have any